Okay. This week we're going to talk about two different ways of thinking where logic breaks down. One of these is called logical fallacies, and the other one is called cognitive biases. And people use these a lot to basically make sense where there is no sense. I'll be using a lot of examples from politics simply because that's where we see a lot of them. Um, The first one that I want to talk about is the straw man argument. And this is where you misrepresent an argument, an opponent's argument, simply to make yours easier to argue. Um, so, for example, if somebody says, well, we need to spend more money on health and education, and somebody responds, well, you just want to leave our country defenseless. No, that's not what you said. You wanted to focus some of the resources in other areas. So, strawman is basically a misrepresentation or an overstatement of an argument to make it easier to argue against. The next one is what we call false cause. And with false cause, you mistake correlation. In other words, something happens and then another thing happens for causation. Um, so just because something is in sequence does not mean that one thing caused another. For example, if I walk through a door and right after I walk through the door an earthquake happens, will say, "Ah, look at that! Closing doors causes earthquakes." No, not related at all. It's correlation. It's not causation. Um, One of the examples that they use is, well, uh, pirates have been decreasing for quite some time, but the temperature of the Earth has been going up since about the same amount of time. So apparently, pirates control the temperature. Correlation, not causation. The next thing I want to talk about is an appeal to emotion. An appeal to emotion is where you attempt to get somebody to feel something rather than to think about something. Um, it's it's a lot easier for people to react emotionally than it is for them to respond with logic. We look at advertising, right? And one of the things that we see, for example, is you see a sexy woman draped over a car, and it's like, oh, sexy woman, car. Therefore, car causes sexy woman. No, the two aren't related at all. You're simply creating an emotional response related to something to get people to think about it in a certain way. Um, Another thing that we see is what's called the fallacy. And the fallacy is okay, somebody argued something incorrectly, therefore the thing is wrong. Well, that's not necessarily true. Somebody can make a poor argument and still be correct about what they're arguing. So, for example, if somebody says, well, a uh, a popular person is saying that eating cheeseburgers is bad for you, therefore eating cheeseburgers is bad for you. Well, whether or not the popular person says it or not has no relation to whether or not it's true. But just because the argument is being made from a poor perspective doesn't mean that the argument itself is wrong. So you have to make an argument based on your own merits, not on the flaws of somebody else's argument. The next one we have is what's called the slippery slope. And this one is is a favorite of a lot of people in politics. Basically, it's if we allow X to happen, or if we allow A to happen, then Z will happen. Now, we're leaving out all of the various steps in between. There's no B, C, D, E, F, G. It just goes straight from A to Z. So one of the places where we see this is, well, if we allow more comprehensive background checks on guns, then we're going to disarm the entire population. They're going to take all of our guns away forever, and we're going to be a disarmed population. Having a background check does not equate to getting all the way to removing everybody's guns. They're two totally different things. So there's a difference between A and Z, and a lot of steps in between that don't necessarily have to happen. If I start on one side of the room and I take a step this direction, if I take a step to my left, it doesn't mean I'm going to go left the entire way. I could turn around and go right. I could go straight. There are numerous other possibilities, but we're going to assume a straight course without any course correction or adjustments. The next one that we're going to deal with is what's called the ad hominem attack. And the ad hominem attack was a favorite of President Trump when he was running for election. Still uses it today. The ad hominem attack is basically an attack on a person's character rather than dealing with the facts of the argument. So, for example, Trump would say crooked Hillary, crooked Hillary, crooked Hillary. He attacked her character. He didn't talk about the issues that she talked about, just the other person and who they were. Lion Ted Cruz, Lion Ted Cruz, he's a liar, just a liar, right? He didn't actually address what Ted Cruz was saying. He just attacked him as a person. And the ad hominem attack basically says, okay, I don't even have to deal with your argument. I'm just going to attack you as a person, and your argument then becomes unnecessary to deal with. The next one we have is kind of a variation of that. It's called tu quo qui. And tu quo qui basically means that you turn criticism back on your attacker, again, without dealing with it. So it's like saying, okay, you make an argument, and the other person's like, yeah, well, you did. Like, it's two kids in a car. Well, he looked at me. Well, he touched me. Well, he said. Well, he did. And nobody's actually saying whether what they did was right or wrong. They're just pointing the finger back at the other person to avoid ever having to deal with the substance of the argument. Personal incredulity. Personal incredulity basically says, I don't understand how something works, therefore it's not true. We are seeing a lot of this in science deniers. I don't understand how the world could be billions of years old. I don't understand how people could evolve from other primates. I don't see how humans could have this big of an effect on the climate. Well, your ignorance doesn't mean that something isn't true, especially when it comes from people who are not ignorant about it, who've studied it, who have put countless hours and billions of dollars in supercomputers to work on an issue. You can't just say, I don't get it, therefore it's not real. That's not a valid way of avoiding an argument. Basically what you're saying is, I'm too lazy to actually get involved and really understand the science behind it. Special pleading. Special pleading is what we call changing the goalposts. In other words, you've said, okay, in order to be believable, you have to meet this standard. Or in order for something to hold true, you have to meet this standard. Well, if that standard gets met, then you're like, oh, I meant that in every case except this particular case, because of XYZ. So we run into this a lot with like psychics, things like that, where people will say, okay, I want you to contact my dead my dead grandparent. And the person's like, okay, I'm going to contact your dead grandparent. Oh, I can't get in touch with your dead grandparent because you don't really believe in me. When in actuality, you surprised them, you gave them something they weren't prepared to go after an answer, and they weren't able to do their research or whatever it is that they normally do to prepare for it. So they change the parameters by which success is measured. So this is called special pleading. Loaded question. A loaded question has a presumption of guilt built into it. Okay? By phrasing the question in such a way to where there is no answer that is correct, you end up putting people in a position where they can't answer the question in any way that is not incriminating. So, for example, if you said, okay, after you killed her, did you bury her in your backyard or did you bury her in the woods? I didn't kill her. No, I asked you, after you killed her, did you bury her in the backyards or in the backyard or in the woods? You built in a presumption of guilt into the question, and there's no way of answering that question without looking guilty. The next one we want to talk about is called burden of proof. Okay, and burden of proof basically says, well, I believe in something, you can't prove that I'm wrong, therefore it's true. So, for example, I can claim right now that I have an invisible magic rabbit hopping around on my desk, and it makes no sound and it never touches anything. Now, you can't prove that I don't, uh, but I can't offer any evidence that I do. And so I say, well, since you can't prove it, my opinion is just as valid. No, if you are going to make a claim that there is an invisible magic rabbit hopping around on your desk, you have to be able to offer up some evidence of it if you want people to believe it and to abide by that presumption. So burden of proof always lies with the person making the claim. It doesn't lie. It's not up to somebody else to disprove the claim. Ambiguity. Um, Ambiguity is a favorite of a lot of people in a variety of positions, politics especially. Um, Ambiguity takes advantage of the fact that language is not concrete, it's not solid. It can have a variety of meanings. So with ambiguity, you can say, um, for example, one of the most famous examples of this was Bill Clinton when he said, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman." Okay, so what Bill said later that he meant after it was proved that he did in fact receive oral sex from an intern in the Oval Office was that, well, we didn't have intercourse. That's what he meant by sexual relations. He knew what was being asked of him. He knew exactly what people were asking. But he took advantage of the ambiguity in language to take advantage of the multiple meanings of sexual relations and say, well, what I meant was this meaning, even though he really knew what they were asking was about a different meaning. All right, let's talk about the gambler's fallacy. If I flip a coin 10 times and it comes up heads 10 times in a row, what are the odds that it's going to come up heads the next time? Now, some people would say, well, about 10% because it's come up heads so many times. No, it's still 50-50. What's happened in the past has no impact on the odds of something happening in the future. Okay? From moment to moment, those odds don't change. And the entire gambling industry, on things like slots, um, on dice, craps, is built on people not understanding their fallacy. There is no such thing as a hot streak. Odds do not change from moment to moment. They stay the same. Um, so relying on some type of a hot streak is not, in fact, based in reality. All right. So another one that we want to deal with is called bandwagon. And what the bandwagon fallacy is that, well, a lot of people believe in this thing, therefore it must be true. Well, a lot of people believing in something has nothing to do with the validity of that belief. People believe that the world was flat for a long time. Turns out they were wrong, all of them. And all of them believing in it didn't change change reality one way or the other. So just because something is popular doesn't mean that it's right. The next one that we want to deal with is what's called an appeal to authority. And I want to be really careful about how we look at this. An appeal to authority says that, well, this person who is in a position of authority believes that it's true, therefore it must be true. Now, even if a person is an authority in a given area, it doesn't mean that they are right. Now, it does give more credence to the argument. What we want to look out for is, for example, 98% of climate scientists believe that global warming, that climate change is caused by humans. 98%. So what people will do is they'll say, well, I know of a climate scientist who doesn't believe this. Well, course. I mean, you're going to find an outlier to everything. But just because somebody's an outlier and they still have some authority in the field doesn't mean that they're right. So strictly using a single authority figure doesn't help. Now, what is helpful is using a high quantity of data to back up your argument provided by people in the field. That's much more useful than relying on a single source. All right, the next one I want to deal with is called composition and division. And composition and division basically says that the properties of the whole are not necessarily the properties of the part, and the properties of the part do not necessarily equal the properties of the whole. So, for example, atoms are invisible. I am made of atoms. Therefore, I am invisible. Well, that's not true. The parts that make me up don't necessarily mean that bringing all those parts together, that the sum of those parts will have the same properties. And it works the other way around. I am visible. Atoms are a part of me. Therefore, atoms are visible. Well, that doesn't work either. We can use this in a variety of ways on groups of people, for example. There are corrupt cops. That doesn't mean that every cop is corrupt, or that a police force itself is corrupt. Conversely, there are Hispanics who are involved in gangs like M5. Doesn't mean that all Hispanics are gangsters. So we have to look at parts and divisions as having separate qualities. The next one that we want to look at is No True Scotsman. And basically what No True Scotsman is it says that no real X would believe that, act like that, whatever. Who is anybody to determine what a real whatever would do? So if we look, for example, at here in the U.S., right? Well, no real American would want socialized medicine. Actually, there's a lot of people who are American who would like that a lot. I hear this one on our campus. No real African American would do X. It's interesting. One of the places that if you're ever interested in watching a fun little web series, look at a web series called Black Girl in a Big Dress. She's a Victorian cosplayer, and her sister's like, or her cousin's like, we're black, we don't do that, and she's like, wrong, I'm black and I do this. So the idea of No True Scotsman is the idea that you have somehow a right to say what a real whatever would do. The next one we want to deal with is what's called the genetic fallacy. And the genetic fallacy deals with the idea that you can judge the merit of something not based on what it is, but rather on where it came from. A lot of times we say, well, you probably heard, well, they're just bad seed. They come from a bad family. Well, somebody's family doesn't dictate who they are. You can be whatever you are, regardless of what your background is. Well, that idea came from. This is one that Trump likes to use a lot. He goes, well, that's just fake news. It comes from the mainstream media. That's fake. Well, let's even hold the proposition that the mainstream media is bad, if we want to hold that. That doesn't mean that what they're saying is wrong. This is what's called the genetic fallacy. You can't just say that where it comes from is wrong and then not deal with the issue itself. All right, the next one we want to talk about is the black or white fallacy. And this is one that oh my God, we have such a hard time with here in the U.S. right now. The black or white fallacy says there's only two possibilities. Either you're with me or you're against me. You're either good or you're bad. We have in America what's called platform politics, okay? And in platform politics, basically it says, okay, The Democratic Party believes this, 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 and this. And the Republican Party believes this, 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 and this. And if you don't hold all those beliefs, then you cannot, by any means, be running. You've got to have all the beliefs. Well, the fact is, most of America, about 40% of Americans, fall somewhere in between those, or perhaps on the outside of one of them. Okay? Only about 30% of the country is registered Democrat, and about 30% is registered Republican. But they present their options as if it's one or the other, and that there is no other option. And this is one of the things that's gotten us into trouble for, quite frankly, decades. All right. The next one is called begging the question. And in begging the question, you end up with a circular argument in which the conclusion is included in the premise of the question. So, and this is not to offend anybody's spiritual beliefs, but this is one that's used a lot of times with the Bible. The Bible is perfect and true. How do we know the Bible is perfect and true? Because the Bible says it's perfect and true. It says so right there in the Bible, that everything in it is correct. That's a circular line of reasoning. You have to be able to break out of it in order, if some type of outside validation, rather than saying this is true and it's true because it says it's true. We end up with this with people as well, with our politicians and leaders. How do we know that this person is telling the truth? Well, because they say they're telling the truth. That's not a way of knowing that somebody's telling the truth or not. So, begging the question where the conclusion is included within the premise of the question itself. The next one I want to deal with is what's called an appeal to nature. And the appeal to nature basically says, well, you know, that we want to do things that are natural, okay? Natural is the best, because if it's natural, then it's good for you. Guys, COVID-19 is natural, okay? Bears eating people, that's a very natural thing. Tornadoes are natural. All of these things are natural. That doesn't mean that they're good, okay? And just because something doesn't come from nature doesn't make it bad. Just because vaccines, for example, are not a natural thing doesn't mean they're intrinsically bad. There's all kinds of things that aren't quote-unquote natural. My glasses, for example, these are not natural. They don't occur in nature. There's no glasses tree out there where I can go pick a new pair. But man, they sure help me see a lot better. So something is not good just because it is natural, and something is not bad just because it is not a natural thing. Anecdotal. Anecdotal is basically says, well, I can tell you a story that disproves that. Okay? Smoking, you know, if you say smoking is bad for you, well, George Burns, a very famous comedian, lived to be 101 years old, and he smoked his entire life. Well, yeah, there's exceptions. You know, one story of one experience is not enough to carry the weight of evidence, okay? You can, as we talked about in class, where anecdotes, where stories are useful for, is evoking pathos within the larger context of an argument. It gives a face to an argument that otherwise might have just not been able to coalesce, okay? The Texas sharpshooter. And with the Texas sharpshooter, this idea is that you have a large amount of evidence, okay? And you have data points here, 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 here. And what you do is you go and you say, aha, okay, so here's some data points that agree with what I want, and I'm going to draw a circle around those data points and say, look, I'm going to ignore all these other data points, okay? So, it's like you make the argument based on limited data, ignoring data that contradicts it, and say that you have found the right thing. So you have to look at a wide variety of evidence, not just the evidence that agrees with you. And you have to understand what that evidence means. And finally, we have the middle ground. And what the middle ground says is that, okay, you believe A, I believe C, therefore the truth is B. So that would be like saying, okay, you say that the person is alive, I say they're dead, therefore they're partially dead. Well, actually the person's really dead. Just because somebody else says that there's a fact that is different doesn't mean that the truth lies in the middle. Okay? The truth is the truth, and the truth doesn't care about how many opinions there are about it. Okay? Reality is reality. There doesn't have to be a middle ground for that. All right. So this is logical fallacies. Um, we're going to have another lecture here on cognitive biases, which is basically where we go in and it affects the way that we approach data, the way we think about data. All right, so have a great day.